Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We're going to give everyone a couple minutes to join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Glad to see everyone this morning. Good morning again. If you're just joining, we're going to give everyone just a minute or two more to join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. We're glad you're here. Good morning for those who've just joined. We're making sure that everyone has a chance to sign on. We had a good number of folks register for this program, which was great to see. If this is your first Zoom with us, or if you've been Zooming with us for a while, there is a chat feature of the Zoom that if you are on your screen, it looks like two text bubbles. That's the Q&A, and the chat is the one text bubble. So if you're having any technical issues or you want to say hello, feel free to send a message in the chat. And then as we move into the program today, if you have specific questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A section of the Zoom, or if you do it in the chat, that's okay as well. I'll be tracking those, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can by the end. And I'll give it just a couple more seconds here to get everyone in that was registered. We're glad that you're here. All righty, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Darling, and I'm the manager of membership and annual giving here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And welcome to our most recent session in our member-only Curator Conversation program. We're so glad that you're here today. And it's hard to believe it, but I'm going to say Happy New Year because this is our first program of the new year. So I hope everyone had a safe and healthy new year. And before we begin, I just did want to say once again, thank you so much for your support as members. We certainly could not do what we do here at the museum without your support, and we truly appreciate it. And this program is given just for you, our members. So I'll wrap up here, but today's program is given by our Senior Director of Curatorial Affairs, and that's Andrew Talkov, and he is going to talk about The Tale of Two Trunks, which I think is going to be very exciting. So without further ado, take it away, Andy.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and I'll echo Elizabeth's sentiment and a Happy New Year to everybody who's watching. I have a feeling that many of you may have been very much enticed by the fact that we'll be talking about one of our most storied collections during my talk today, which it's hard to believe was a discovery made almost 20 years ago of the trunks that belonged to Mary Custis Lee. But as I was thinking about what we would do for our curator conversation in February, and it being Black History Month, I also thought about another discovery that was also very important for helping us understand the history of one family, as well as the experience of Black Virginians over the course of 3 generations. So today we're going to talk about these 2 really remarkable discoveries, which as someone responsible for helping to build the VMHC collections, it always is remarkable to me about just what is still out there that we have not yet found that can give us insight into our past. So again, today it's the story or a tale of 2 trunks. And our first segment is Keeping Up with the Joneses. So in 2010, the VMHC became aware of this chest. I'll loosely call it a trunk. It was found in a barn in Mecklenburg County, and it is clearly, as you can see from this image, hadn't been a particularly treasured artifact, but a practical one. It's faded coat of red paint, marred by use, a crude hand-forged clasp to secure its lid. This was a simple barn chest or house chest, probably used to store tools or seed or feed. And really, just to look at it, it is unremarkable in many ways. But once the chest was open, it turned out that it revealed remarkable pieces of the story of a single Virginia family that, had it not been brought to our attention or to the attention of some other collecting institution, this story would have been really lost to history. So packed inside this chest were hundreds of letters and contracts and financial documents, receipts, dozens of greetings cards, because who doesn't collect greetings cards, postcards, and even a few photographs that spanned a period from the 1870s all the way up to the 1960s. The earliest document that we were able to find here was dated September 3rd, 1874, and it was from Rylan Allen to his brother James Jones in Prince Edward County, asking, among other things, how married life was treating him. So James Jones was born into slavery in 1851, and he was only 14 years old then when the Civil War ended, not far from where we assume that he grew up in Prince Edward County. We do know that his parents were Mike and Mariah Jones, but we're not entirely sure, as we can talk about a little bit later, about who their enslaver was. But of course, with emancipation came opportunity. And so we know that James married Charity Scott in 1872. James was 21 years old at the time. And we know that the couple between 1874 and 1880 had 4 children: Rosetta, James B. Jones, Martha, Anthony, And so what I did for today's program is I mined a couple of parts of this collection to help tell a story about Black Virginians in the decade after, or maybe decade and a half after emancipation. And so we'll call this story Mr. Jones Goes to Richmond. So by 1879, we know that the Jones family was, like many formerly enslaved Black families across Virginia and across the South, were sharecropping in Prince Edward County. And although we're not exactly sure what work he did when he went to Richmond, we know that in July 1879, he left charity with their, at that time, 3 children to manage their farm. So what follows is some of the correspondence between the two of them, which is great that we have sort of both sides of their correspondence that offers some insight into their lives. And as I found preparing for this program, also begs just so many questions. So here's the first note that I was able to find between the two of them. It's dated July 30th, 1879. You can see that it's written on a small card, and he announces to his wife that he had arrived safely in Richmond and that Mr. Thomas Treadway was taking good care of him and that he was going to write soon. And that he remains her loving husband, right? So a very simple note, and then he includes the address. So really one of the questions is, who is Thomas Treadway? And why is James staying with him? And so after a little digging, primarily through the census, I was able to learn that Thomas Treadway was 62 years old in 1880, so maybe 61, 62 by the time this letter was written. He was married, his wife Evelina, and that in the 1880 census in Richmond, he was listed as a fire insurance agent, but that if you went back to the 1870 census, he was listed as a farmer in Prince Edward County. And if you went back to the 1860 census, which was really fascinating, he was listed as a farmer of pretty substantial means in Prince Edward County. In fact, in the same neighborhood in which James Jones continued to live after he came to maturity and started farming on his own. And we know that Thomas Treadway enslaved 74 people in 1860. Unfortunately, the slave schedule for 1860 for Thomas Treadway lists the genders and ages of all of these people, but unfortunately their names are lost to history until some new documentation is discovered. And so it left me with a lot of questions, as I'm sure you're asking all these questions too. So one question is, could Treadway have actually been the enslaver of James and his parents? Which is certainly a possibility. It also begs the question, and we think that perhaps Thomas Treadway owns the land that James is actually sharecropping, and that's the actual relationship between Thomas Treadway and James Jones. It's really it starts to open doors, really interesting doors, to the questions about the relationships between former slaveholders and the people that they formerly enslaved. And so, of course, we want to know more about James Jones and this relationship. And I think more research hopefully will bring some more information to light. So on August 11th, we see the first note that is returned to him from Charity Jones. I want you to notice when looking at this, first of all, it's dated Prospect, Virginia, which is in Prince Edward County. I want you to notice how good the penmanship is here, and how actually very good, with a few exceptions, the spelling is in this document. And of course here, the text is very much what you would expect of a Victorian letter. She writes, "Dear husband, your kind and welcome letter came to hand yesterday, and I was truly glad to hear from you and to know that you was doing so well. Nothing affords me more comfort in your absence than to hear, that you are well and doing well, and I hope we'll get along well," and etc. She perhaps hints about why James may actually be in Richmond in this note. She says that, "I think you will, as you are a man that I am satisfied will do exactly what he says." And so it makes me wonder, as I read this, about whether there was some obligation that James had to Thomas Treadway that he was trying to fulfill by going to Richmond and doing work for a short period of time with him. And then, of course, Charity is left to oversee the farm. So she makes note that she'll take good care of the hogs and chickens and is doing the best she can do about tobacco. And then she says, "Accept a wife's love and write soon, your wife until death, Charity Jones." So there's a response that comes back on August 16th, which I think opens some other really interesting questions about the Jones family. So first of all, he starts with some financial news that he sent some money and that he needs to go to Mr. Walden, who was clearly a local merchant, and get a receipt for it. So they're trying to settle up some accounts. But what's really interesting here is that he says to tell one of his sisters that he found his brother, Anthony Jones, and his brother, Jim Addison Jones, both living in Richmond, both working at the nail factory on Belle Island. And this is really interesting because it suggests, given that he's telling Charity that this news and that Anthony has a wife and 3 children, and that Jim Addison has a wife and 1 child, going back into the census, it's pretty clear that James hasn't seen either of these people in at least the 5 years since Anthony had started having children. But it does also suggest that they could have been separated much longer ago, even perhaps during slavery, which speaks to an experience that many African American families had in the aftermath of the war, which was trying to find family members who had been separated through sale. It's also interesting that in Richmond, Anthony owns a lot and house where he lives. And so then back to farming news. It says, "Take good care of our sweet potatoes and keep the moles and pigs and other rogues out of the patch," right? And then he says, "Be careful about fire," because he's very uneasy about that. Let me hear from you next week. And I see that Vicky and John have questions about Charity and James's ability to read and write, which I'll talk about here in just a second. So here, Charity responds, and she says that she received his letter from the 16th and was he had said that he had a cold, so she was, hoped that he was well. But she apologizes for not being able to write sooner because she couldn't find someone to actually write the letter for her. And so what's really interesting here is that going through these chronologically, you wonder the same question about, their writing style, about their level of education, about where they learned to read and write. And clearly, Charity, and as we'll see in a minute, James, were unable to read and write at the time. And so what this means is that they were finding people to write letters for them. Charity seems to use the same person a few times, and then, as we'll see in a second, there's a shift. James also apparently has the same writer helping him. But it's also obvious here as we move into the next letter. Of course, this letter I thought was really wonderful because she says that she has a good, they've been very successful growing watermelons, and she wishes that he was there to help her eat them. But then here's the next letter in the cycle, which actually was written the same day as the one before. And you can see this is in a completely different hand, just as the first note that James had was not in the same hand as the last note. It's very short. And it makes me wonder who is writing these letters. This note says that he, because of the mail, they're writing at the same time. And so he says, I wrote to you last week and haven't received any answer. So write back as soon as you get this. And then he said that, he sends regards to family, but that he is at his brother Anthony's house for a couple of days. And I was able to find in the census that at this time, Anthony can't read and write either. So one of the great mysteries is who is helping the Joneses write back and forth between one another and read the letters that they're getting when they come back and forth. I suspect that perhaps Thomas Treadway may be helping on James's side at times, but I'm not really sure yet who was helping Charity write notes. And you can see as we move on to the next one, from Prospect, September 4th, 1879, she writes, Dear Jim, my fodder is ripe. You must send me some money to save it or make some arrangement too soon. If I had the money, I'd hire some hands to save it. All is well. Now write me as soon as you get this and let me know what to do about the fodder. And this note is just so completely different from the other notes. It lacks that, the Victorian flourish of a letter, of the earlier letters. It's simpler in language. It is simpler in spelling. And so really, it just makes you wonder, who is helping her write these letters to her husband. But it also points to the fact that, the efforts that they would go to be able to communicate with each other when they were separated, during this period. Sort of immediately following up these letters in this chest, we find this sheet. This is back and front. It's the account that Jim Jones had with Mr. Walden. And so these types of records give us just such wonderful insight into the daily lives of the Jones family and of any family who had an account. These are inventories essentially of what people are purchasing and what people are selling. So the way these read is on the far left is the date, in the center is the item, and then DR at the top in that first column represents debt, or basically what they are purchasing from Mr. Walden, and then credit is what the Joneses are actually paying to him. And it seems like instead of giving him goods, which is sometimes the case, to pay their debts, they're actually transferring cash, which we learned earlier from the letter that James sent. And so here we get a little insight into, the activities of the family between June and August in this same period, or roughly the same period that they're writing these letters. Charity is clearly buying fabric to make clothes. She's buying calicos and brown domestic cloth and buttons and cotton thread for that purpose. They're purchasing provisions like molasses and bacon and sugar, which show up here. And then what I found interesting is that they're also buying from Mr. Walden. You can see, let's see if I can make the laser pointer work. You can see here that they purchased 3 pounds of shot and a 1/4 pound of powder. And so clearly they're supplementing their agricultural income through hunting, which is a neat piece of information to have that kind of pieces together their lives. We can also see through documents like this, what the costs of items were at that particular time. So really a treasure trove of information about this little period in the life of James and Charity Jones. But let's see if I can make that laser pointer go away. Well, there we go. Bye-bye. But we can also learn a little bit more about some of the other documents that were in this chest. And I'll call this section political operative. So with the abolition of slavery, Black men immediately began to lobby for their full rights as citizens of the United States. And the first election in Virginia in which Black men voted and their votes were actually counted, there were efforts immediately after the war in 1865 of a number of Black men in Tidewater to vote, but their votes were not counted. But the first vote in which they had full participation was for delegates to a constitutional convention in 1867 and 1868. 24 Black men from across the state were elected to represent their communities and form a new constitution of Virginia. Beginning in 1869, African Americans began to be elected to the General Assembly. They were almost universally members of the Republican Party, so the party of Lincoln. Of course, in 1870, the 15th Amendment prohibited the federal government and each state from denying a citizen the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so James Jones enters this story when he reaches his majority at the age of 21, which would have been in 1872 about. And probably the first election in which he participated would have been in the election of 1873, where 20 Black men were elected to the House of Delegates, including a Prince Edward County native, Tazewell Branch. But as many of you are familiar, despite federal protections, voting rights for Black Virginians were continuously under assault by conservative whites in Virginia. And in 1876, the white conservatives who held power began instituting what we would generally associate with Jim Crow and with the 1902 Constitution. They started instituting poll taxes and passed laws that would strip men that were convicted of even the smallest offenses of their right to vote. And so we really can't know what made James Jones become politically active? We can suspect that given the opportunity, he would want to exercise his rights as a citizen, but he did more than just execute his rights. So by 1878, we know that Jones had become very active in Republican Party politics. There are notes in the documents that that suggest that he was going to Petersburg on some regular basis to participate in party meetings. But based on the contents of this collection, we know that Jones became particularly involved in voter registration, echoing our current times. And one piece of that evidence is this certificate by the Grand Army of Republicans, which I think is a reference to the Grand Army of the Republic, which was generally what the Union Army was referred to, certainly after the war. And he became a member of the Organization of Tens. You can see in the top line of the main text, James Jones is written in. It says that he is a veteran Republican, not meaning veteran, military veteran, but meaning that he had been active for quite some time. And that it was his responsibility to enroll 10 other men to be engaged in the election of national, state, and county officers that were favorable to Republican policies. And so, amazingly enough, we then get to see the evidence of his efforts. So here's a sheet that James Jones, the family kept. His name is listed at the bottom of the front, which is on your left, as the captain. They were in Buffalo Township, Prince Edward County. And these are the 10 men that he was able to enlist in voting. All of these men were Black men in the community. They all lived in Prince Edward County or nearby Farmville, or in Farmville. I did some digging to try to identify who some of these people might be. It's a little bit difficult. We know that James was still unable to write in 1878, so it does beg the question, who was noting the names? Clearly, he didn't sign his own name at the bottom. But of the 10 men, I was unable to find Branch Wright, who's listed at the top. Pleasant Robeson is a 35-year-old laborer. John Jackson was an 18-year-old farm worker in 1880. Or 1878, I should say. Albert Williams was a 48-year-old farmer. Paige Carter was a 36-year-old farm laborer. As we get down toward the bottom, some of the writing becomes very difficult to decipher. So I don't know whether it looks like Phil Horse. I was unable to find him in the historical record. If one of you can identify what the first name of the next person on the list is, I will send you my deep personal thanks. But the last name looked like Tunner or Tummer, and was unable to find him. Lewis Johnson was a 56-year-old laborer. Arthur Terry was a 48-year-old laborer from Farmville, and William H. Anderson was a 48-year-old laborer. So here are also the names of members of that community. Oh, Isaac. Thanks, Larissa. That actually makes a lot of sense. So I'll go back and look for Isaac Tunner or Tummer. But clearly these are people whose stories are also now, little piece, becoming available as a result of this document having been saved. It is very likely, based on what we found in the chest, that Jones, like many other Black Virginians, joined what's called the Readjuster Party in 1879, 1880. So for those of you unfamiliar, the Readjusters were a biracial coalition that included both Democrats and Republicans, who sought to adjust downward the amount of public debt that had been incurred in the decades before the Civil War and during the war, and instead proposed that the funds saved be used for internal improvements, primarily a cause that had become very popular in the Black community, which was public education. And so with strong support of Black voters, the Readjusters had a very shining moment in the very early 1880s. In 1881, they won all of the statewide offices and controlled both houses of the General Assembly. But by 1883, conservative white Democrats regained control of statewide politics and continued a trend of passing laws that would further restrict Black voting, which then leads to the question. So this Readjuster ticket, I should mention, Jones would have lived in the 4th district. And this is not the ticket that we found in his collection. The ticket we found in his collection was in very poor condition and was difficult to read. So this is another ticket we have in our collection that I thought I would share. And so after this period of political activity, Jones, there's no more evidence of Jones's particular political affiliation. It's possible he could have been forced out of the process, or that he chose to no longer participate. I think probably the former is more likely, but we just don't know. Those documents weren't saved. What we do know is that James and Charity were able to purchase a farm for themselves in Prince Edward County by 1888, and that James passes in 1926. Charity preceded him in death in 1904. So the family archives passed from James and Charity Jones down to their son, Anthony, who was born in 1880, and his wife, Sally. Now, I'm not going to be able to go through all of the other items, hundreds of items that we found in the chest. There's just a smattering here. And maybe that'll be, for a different program. Anthony does move to Mecklenburg County, which is how all of these documents ended up in Mecklenburg. This piece on the left is a life insurance policy in the amount of $125 that was issued by the Grand Fountain United Order of True Reformers, which was a Black fraternal organization that was formed in Richmond after the decline of another United Order of True Reformers. And among the various services that they provided to the Black community across the Commonwealth was life insurance. And so this is Anthony Jones's policy. Also inside the chest was Sally Jones's card that said that she was a certified member of the Fluke Cured Tobacco Cooperative in her area. And so we know that Anthony and Sally unfortunately don't have the same success as his father did. During the Great Depression, they continued to grow tobacco. They took out extensive loans, many of which were provided by the federal government. But it seems that based on all of the invoices and receipts that we found in the collection, of which there are hundreds, it does seem like, they were having a difficult time, under mounting debt to continue. The chest also includes items from their daughter, Luratha. And finally, the last papers that were added were added to the chest by Theodore Roosevelt Jones, whose papers in the 1960s, were deposited. There were very few photographs that were in the chest. Here are a couple of examples. I'm thinking these are probably, date to the late 40s, early 50s maybe. And unfortunately, they're not marked on the back. So it's very difficult to understand who these people are. And I leave you with probably the most recent photograph of a young girl whose identity we just don't know. So even though the chest offered so much information about the Jones family and their history, their successes and their struggles, there's a lot left, to be learned from this treasure trove. So now I'm going to go back a decade earlier, before the Jones chest came into our collection, and talk a little bit about what may have drawn many of you to this conversation, which is the trunks of Mary Custis Lee. So in 2002, there were two, this is one of them, wooden trunks that were, I'll say, rediscovered at Burke and Herbert Bank and Trust Company in Alexandria, Virginia, which is to this day the oldest bank continuing to operate in Virginia. Many of you are probably familiar with this story, but for those who aren't, a New York lawyer by the name of Robert E. Lee DeButz, he's Robert E. Lee's great-great-grandson, and had become the family historian, had been doing a lot of research. And as he did work about Mary Custis Lee, he kept coming up against stories about her world travels. And so one of the questions that came to his mind is, how did she fund all of these this lifestyle? She had traveled most of her life. And so knowing that Burke and Herbert had been the Lee family bank, he called an old classmate of his, Hunt Burke, who was the vice chairman of the bank, and asked if there were any financial records at the bank that may lead him to some insight about how she funded her adventures. And Hunt Burke said, of course, that there were some records, and he said, "Are you also interested in the trunks?" And Robert DeButz said, "What trunks?" And so he immediately took a trip to Alexandria, Virginia, and in the Silver Vault, it's called, were these two trunks. And when they opened them, very similar to the Jones family, it revealed that the trunks held just a treasure trove of information. 4,500 letters, legal papers, journals, souvenirs from Mary Lee's travels, financial records, and artifacts that belonged to Mary Custis Lee, who was the eldest daughter, the second child of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The addition of this collection to the VMHC makes us the largest single repository to hold Lee family papers. So a little bit about Mary Custis Lee. She was born in 1835 at Arlington House. And in 1840, when Robert E. Lee and the family moved to St. Louis, he was, of course, attached to the U.S. Army. Mary actually decided to stay back at Arlington, or at least it was decided that Mary, a 5-year-old Mary, I guess she doesn't make too many decisions as a 5-year-old, although everything that we know about her says that, she was a very strong personality. So maybe at 5, she made that decision. But she did decide to stay with her grandparents, George Washington Parke Custis and Mary Lee Fitzhugh. And during her time at Arlington, they imbued in her a sense of history and shared much of the history that was at Arlington associated with not only the with the Washington line of the family and the Custis line of the family. During the Civil War, Mary was frequently separated from her family, spent quite a bit of time behind Union lines. After the war, Mary did not join her parents, but continued to travel. She was, even though they corresponded and were friendly, she wasn't able to return to Lexington in time for her father's funeral or the funerals of her mother or sister, Agnes, in 1873. But in the 1870s, her brother, Custis, was trying to get compensation from the US government for Arlington. And when a Supreme Court ruling judged in his favor and Custis sold Arlington, she became the beneficiary of some of that money. And in fact, that is in some ways how she may have supported, her lifestyle. She returned to the United States rarely in the late 19th century, but she did come back in 1914 when war broke out in Europe. And she died in Hot Springs, Virginia on November 22nd, 1918, at the age of 83. And she had in many ways become, in part, the family historian. And I think that these trunks traveled with her, collected her own history, but also I think the items in the trunk, in addition to preserving them, became items that during her visits with, the people that you would want to know across Europe, she would share these great stories, of her family. So among some of the items that were found in the trunk that you may have heard of that I'm actually not going to talk about very much today. The earliest piece was a 1694 letter from John Custis II, who was the family's first English immigrant, to merchants back in England about tobacco crop and the shipbuilding industry on Virginia's eastern shore. Very well known among the objects in the trunk is a handwritten copy by Lee of General Order 61 that announced the death of Stonewall Jackson to the Army. I think what makes that significant is that it was written in his hand, not by a clerk, not in printed form, but actually in his hand. And in fact, we can share a link in the chat to a story on our website about General Order 61. There were stars from Lee's uniform. There was a 1766 list of individuals that were enslaved by a then 12-year-old John Parke Custis, who was George Washington's stepson. That was also found in the chest. But the story that I want to share with you today, two stories, are stories about two of the formerly enslaved members at Arlington, the first being Selina Gray. So most of you probably know that when Virginia officially seceded from the Union on May 24th, 1861, by referendum, The US Army immediately crossed the Potomac to seize Arlington and Alexandria. This is an image of Union General Irvin McDowell, who's standing sort of at center right, facing directly to the left. The Arlington House was seized by Union troops. It's a very advantageous position if you're the Union Army and want to protect the capital, Arlington Heights. And so Selina Gray becomes somewhat famous in history as a result of that. But a little bit about Selina Gray. This is a photograph found in 2004 on eBay, owned by the National Park Service, that shows Selina Gray at the far right and what are thought to be two of her daughters. The photograph was very likely taken at the time of the Civil War, at some time during Union occupation. Selina Gray was a second-generation enslaved person at Arlington. She was born in December of 1823 to Leonard and Sally Norris. She married another enslaved African-American from Arlington in 1824. He was born in 1824. They were married. His name is Thornton Gray. And the two of them had 8 children: Emma, Annis, Florence, Sarah, Ada, Selina, John, and Harry. And they raised this family, all 10 of them, in a single room in the South Slave Quarters at Arlington. Selina Gray became the personal maid of Robert E. Lee's wife. And in 1861, when the Union Army was bound to approach, Mary Lee took the family and evacuated Arlington and entrusted the household to Selina Gray. Locked away inside Arlington were, of course, many of the Washington, family treasures that, and Custis family treasures that that Mary Custis Lee would have been very familiar with. And so Selina Gray notices that the Union Army, which is now using the house as headquarters, that items are being stolen by Union soldiers. And so she confronts soldiers, telling them not to touch any of these things. And then she actually goes to the general, commanding General McDowell, and he has the remaining items sent to the patent office for safekeeping. Selina Gray and all of the enslaved people at Arlington were freed by George Washington Parke Custis's will in December 29th, 1862. When he died in 1857, he had put a 5-year limit on the emancipation of the enslaved population at Arlington. And she continued to live at Arlington for several years. Ironically, if you're thinking about dates, this is the date that, 3 days before the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. One of the letters that Mary Custis Lee saved was this letter to her mother, so Robert E. Lee's wife, from Selina Gray in 1872. It's a 4-page letter. This is the first page and the final page. And just a few excerpts. She says, "Mrs. Lee, I received your letter and was hoping to hear from you, and I was hoping to see you once more at Arlington. It is a most lovely place now, everywhere around. It looks beautiful. There is not a tree to be seen except in the cemetery. The whole of it is rented to the freemen. They have little huts all over that beautiful place. The place is changed so you would hardly know it your things at the time of the war was taken away by everybody. So the officers would have them in their tents and all over the ground. By the way, I should mention that it's very likely that Selina Gray had been taught to read and write by Mary Lee as during her life. So this is likely her hand that you see here. She said, "I underwent a great deal to stay at Arlington as long as I did, having so many inferior persons to contend with, but I am very happy that I have got a comfortable home of my own, now down by the factory about halfway to Alexandria. We have 10 acres of land. It is very poor, but we hope in time to improve it." And then she notes that a couple of the enslaved people were still living that Mary Lee would have known, Austin Branham and Louisa Bingham. She talks about the work that they're doing. As we move on, she says that she wants her to remember her to the Lee family children, and that she was so sorry to hear of this trouble. I've seen him once. This is her son, or Custis, since the war, and he reminded me so much of his father. I trust I may see the day yet when you all will have Arlington. I hope that I may yet be able to see you, as I am very anxious to. No more from your humble servant, Selina Gray. I think she means, as I'm very anxious to know more from your humble servant, Selina Gray. You can see it's broken here about the center of the letter. So a fascinating letter that suggests the complexities of the relationship, but again, between Selina Gray, who was formerly enslaved, and the woman who enslaved her. A couple of points about the Freeman's Village. This is a map of the Freeman's Village in 1865 that was near Arlington Heights. These here are the huts that she refers to that was housing for the formerly enslaved. There was also a school here, a hospital here. There's an image. Ooh, come on now. There's an image here done by Alfred Woad during the war that also shows the Freeman's Village, at the base of Arlington Heights. This remained active until the late 1880s into the early 1890s before it was liquidated. And then here is an image from our own collection of what was then the contraband camp in 1862 that was below Arlington Heights. That is from our collection by Robert Knox Sneeden, the Union map maker and artist, showing his interpretation of some of the activity there. So I know our time is getting short, and I do want to leave time to answer some questions, but I do also want to mention another letter found in this collection is that of William Burke. So George Washington Parke Custis, the owner of Arlington, became a supporter of the American Colonization Society in 1817. The American Colonization Society was designed to raise funds, and because white Virginians felt that the two races would be unable to continue to live together, and there was a growing population of emancipated and freed Blacks, there was in Virginia and elsewhere, there was an effort to to colonize and return them to West Africa, to the country, what became Liberia. So here you can see in the lower left corner a map of the location of Liberia and a detail here. And in 1853, George Washington Parke Custis emancipated William and Rosabella Burke and their 4 children, who sailed on a ship called the Banshee out of Baltimore with 261 emigrants to Liberia. Among the things that you needed to have in order to go was the ability to read and write and a trade. So William Burke apprenticed himself as a blacksmith in Philadelphia before he left Virginia. They were the only, as far as we know, enslaved people from Arlington to emigrate. And Burke studied Latin and Greek in a seminary in Monrovia, which was the capital of Liberia. He became a Presbyterian minister in 1857, and he helped educate his children and other members of the community. Burke corresponded with Mary Custis Lee and relied on the Lees to convey messages to and from relatives still in Virginia. So this is a letter that Burke wrote to the Reverend Ralph Randolph Gurley, who was the head of the American Colonization Society. And these are all of the pages, as you can see. Has a very readable, good hand. What's interesting about this letter, I felt, was that he notes that he talks about the war. This is in 1867. He says, "The war of the United States has affected us much through in this far-off land. Everything very scarce and very high. The affliction caused by the war of the United States has been very great, yet we cannot but regard it as the means employed by God to break the strong bond of slavery. Many means were employed by God in Egypt to free Israel from bondage, but none availed until blood was shed." And then he comments on Arlington. He says, "In regard to Arlington, be kind enough to write and inform us, particular in regard to that place, whether Mr. Lee is there, et cetera, et cetera. You will confer a great favor on us by informing us in regard to the old people of Arlington, in particular, my dear old mother, who I have not heard from for a long time." And so in wrapping up, these 2 letters found among what became famous as a collection of Lee family papers were associated with Mary Custis Lee, just demonstrates to us again that that Black history, especially of this period, which can be at times difficult to capture for the obvious reasons, few people recording it, the inability of that population to record in writing their own histories, the disbursement of families that disrupts the historical record. It's just remarkable that in these 2 collections, one focused on one Black family and another not at all focused on a Black family, but that still gives us deep insights into the stories of individuals and the Black experience in Virginia and America. So having rediscovered these, I'm going to ask you all to go and look and see what's in your closet and see what you might be able to find that will help us open doors to new knowledge about the past. So thank you. And now I'll look to your questions.
Thank you so much, Andy. So we do have a couple of questions. We're probably, just to honor everyone's time, we're not going to be able to answer all questions because we did have quite a few. But we do have one. So going back to the first trunk that we discussed, for the folks that were helping the Joneses, both in Richmond and in Prince Edward County, to read and write the letters, is it possible that members in church communities could be the ones that would facilitate those letters?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that actually makes a fair amount of sense, that church communities, or, as we saw with, in the Mary Custis Lee papers, there were enslaved people who, and then by the time, we see the Joneses papers, there may have been enslaved people in that community who also could have been helping them, to write or read pieces. And I think, or other allies, in that area. So sure, the church community could have been a very good avenue to help them on both ends.
And then we have a dimension question for the Jones's trunk. What's the size of it? Is there sort of the size of a, I don't know, large suitcase, that sort of dimension comparison?
No, so it's about the size of a bench. So it's probably I would say maybe 4 feet wide, and maybe 18 inches tall. So literally, I mean, it could have been at one time. It has been referred to in our collection as like a bench in some ways. So it's almost exactly the dimensions of a bench, a little bit deeper.
And then for the Lee trunks, are they similar in size?
Well, the Lee trunks are pretty good sized steamer trunks. So a little taller and a little narrower.
Okay, great. And then moving on in questions. So there's a question for Selena Gray. She mentions in her letter that she's moved and that the land where she's living is poor. Do we have an idea of where she is living?
So she says in the letter, so there is some sense that she may have moved down into an area of Arlington that I think is called Green Valley. So it's not very far from Arlington House. And as she said, I think it's, sort of halfway between the factory, which I suspect would have been located by the water, and the house.
Okay.
But the exact location isn't known as far as I know.
And then another question about the Jones family. Does the VMHC or perhaps the Library of Virginia have a broader archive of life insurance papers or organizational histories, whether established by Black Virginians or more broadly?
So I'm not sure about the collection of the Library of Virginia. The VMHC has some items, but not an extensive history associated. So it's very, we have recently even collected some items related to the United Order of Tents, which was another fraternal organization, the United Order of True Reformers. But we find these pieces sort of separated from much larger collections, but we do try to pick them up when we can. So there are some in the collection, but not an extensive, deep collection of primary source material in our collection about them. I know that also the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia has items also related to these organizations. But again, I don't know that there's a deep archive there of all of the policies either.
Okay, and again, in the interest of honoring everyone's time, this will be the last question. If you do have specific questions, you can always reach out to us via email. There's a page on our website that has Ask a Question of our research and curatorial team as well. So the last question was related to the Lee trunks. Was the bank ever going to make these public? Who really owned them at the discovery point?
That's a really good question. So I think that, so I know that I don't know what the bank was going to do ultimately. I think they sat in the corner for, 90, almost 100, well, 90 some odd years with, without anyone seeking out, an owner. I've never been in the silver vault of that bank, so I'm not exactly sure how it would be easy or difficult to lose sight, lose track of a couple of steamer trunks. Um, but what I do know is that they were brought by Robert DeButts to the Historical Society and were assessed by Lee Shepard and others who he was the head of our collections at that time. And the trunks are on, technically they're on a long-term loan by the family to the Historical Society, but there are a number of family members involved in making that decision. So I think that there's not a single clear owner of the material in the trunks. I think ownership is divided among a number of family members.
All right. Well, again, I know that there are more questions, but we do want to honor everyone's time. So thank you all for joining us today. And thank you so much to Andy for a really insightful program. Mark your calendars. The next curator conversation will take place on April 26th. And that will be a sneak preview of an upcoming partner exhibition that the VMHC will do with the Black History Museum of Virginia. And we do have plenty of other programming that will take place virtually. Please check out our website for a full list of our upcoming events. We've got plenty of offerings for February. And for those that live locally in the Richmond area, we will also be bringing back our Member Monday programs in our Virginia House Gardens later on this spring. So look for more information on that. We're planning on hosting those in April and May. And again, thank you all so much for tuning in and of course for your support as members of the VMHC. We truly appreciate it. And I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.